Okay, let's get started. So I am so pleased to be your host tonight. My name is Colleen Gregerson. I am the Executive Director of Battery Power here at the Battery, and it is my honor to be having this conversation tonight with Congressman Eric Swalwell. I have been wanting to have you on for an event for a while now, and we just haven't been able to make it happen, but maybe it was all for the best because now you have a book out that we're going to talk about, and there's obviously just a lot going on in the world. So we will have plenty of ground to cover for tonight's chat. Just a few logistics before we dive in. For all of you joining us, we are in webinar mode tonight, which means that your video is not on and you're muted as well. So feel free to make dinner, have a drink, whatever you want. We cannot see you, but we will have time for questions from the audience. So please do enter your questions using the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can just pop your questions in there anytime throughout our conversation. Don't feel like you have to wait until the end. Pop them in there, and as we get to the end of our conversation, I'll make sure I pull as many of those out as possible so we can get to lots of questions. Eric, I see that you are joining us from the brand new bar at the Battery.
This is not my Zoom background. This is
not
a real place. Yeah.
It's a real place. It's a brand new place. We're just waiting to open it to when it's a safe time to open that up for our members. But I'm glad that you're getting a chance to check it out in the meantime. I of course am at home, and hopefully we'll be free of distractions from kids and dogs. Just a quick introduction for you folks who are joining, and maybe this is the first time that you're meeting Congressman Swalwell. He grew up in the East Bay in the district that he now represents, first in his family to attend college. It was during college that he interned with his congressperson, which was Ellen Tosher. And then he went on to law school. And after completing law school, he went on to be a prosecutor at the Alameda County District Attorney's Office for 7 years, while also serving in a bunch of different roles for the city of Dublin, California, including being elected to the City Council of Dublin. Then he was elected to Congress in 2012 to represent the 15th District. Many of you probably live in that district. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, in the East Bay, covers the majority of the East Bay. And now Congressman Swalwell is in his fourth term in Congress, right? Good. And he might be representative to the world, but he is just dad at home to his young children, Nelson and Cricket, right?
Yep.
I'm just going to mention a couple of things that Eric has done in the House of Representatives, because he's done a lot. He founded the Future Forum, which is a group of young Democratic members of Congress focused on issues and opportunities for millennial Americans. And I imagine that really impacted your run for the Democratic presidential nomination last year, because one of your top priorities that you placed on that was ending gun violence. So we'll have some time to talk about that as well. And he also serves on the House Committee on Intelligence and the Judiciary Committee. And it is, in fact, those two positions that gave Congressman Swalwell such a unique vantage point into the impeachment of President Trump. I believe you are one of only 3 people that sit on both of those committees. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. And those were really the two that were charged with the duties of the impeachment process. So kind of given that unique view and perspective, I want to start with one of my most pressing questions, which is, what have you been binge watching during the pandemic?
So, Never Have I Ever is an unexpected favorite. It's Mindy Kaling's. It's like a teen comedy, and I didn't think I would like it, but I love all things Mindy Kaling, so have binged on that. But also Ozark, and they're going into their final season. Hopefully they'll be filming this October, but we love Ozark as well. My wife loves Normal People. I couldn't.
Oh, I loved that one.
Did you?
Oh, yeah.
So I just never got into that one. So that was just kind of, you watch that on your own time, and we'll do. And then Waco, we watched
okay.
Waco, the documentary, which also was very, very good.
Okay.
So, what about you?
Have you ever heard of Rectify?
No.
Oh God, it's great. There's like 5 seasons, and it's fiction, but it's about someone who is wrongly accused and sent to death row, but then is then is exonerated. So it's just great, really good character development. And if you like it, there's a lot of seasons. So,
and I'm looking forward. Sarah Cooper announced today that she's getting her own Netflix special. She's the comedian that does the 60-second vignettes.
I lost the sound on you. There you go. Sorry, I lost your sound for a second.
Sarah Cooper has a Netflix special coming out. She's the comedian that, look her up on Twitter. She does Trump in like 60 seconds, whatever he's done that day. She enacts it. So it's his voice, but she's doing the expressions. She's hilarious. So I'm eager to see that.
Okay, good. Well, we have some stuff to add to our list now. You've mentioned some that I haven't watched yet, so we'll put that on there. Well, let's talk about your book for a minute. So the book is called Endgame, and it was released the end of June. It's a fantastic read. If you haven't picked it up yet, I really encourage you to go to your local bookstore and pick it up. It's about the impeachment process and the trial from an insider perspective, but it's also really a book about courage. Why did you feel it was so important that you share the details of the impeachment process and your experience through a book?
I wanted to really highlight the courage of the people who came forward. You know, my sense is that there's still corruption going on inside the White House, and that if you honor the courage of those who risked their lives and livelihood to speak truth to power, that in a small way may make people believe that the honorable thing to do is to come forward. And I hope that courage begets courage. I also wanted to, frankly, condemn those who were complicit in enabling corruption with their silence, and really call it out, because just as you should honor the courage, you know, I feel that too many knew it was wrong and didn't say anything and didn't stop the president when he needed to be checked. But also recognizing that the president was not going to be removed from office by the Senate, that we're not helpless, that in the way that we marched after Donald Trump was elected, you know, the Women's March on January 21, the marches for climate and science, and the March for Our Lives generation that came out of Parkland, that we can move to the ballot box this November. And that's where he'll ultimately be removed, is not by a Senate proceeding, but by democracy, fulfilling its charge.
Mm. You mentioned, those, highlighting the courage of those who did come forward and condemning to some extent those who didn't. Is one of those people John Bolton? And can you tell us a little bit more about the decisions that you all made around, not subpoenaing him to come in and testify? Tell us a little bit more about that.
John Bolton was the national security advisor, and we had pretty good evidence from the witnesses who did come forward that John Bolton knew more than they knew because he was so close to the president. And so to back up, right, we're talking about the president this point last year, taking $400 million that the Ukrainians were supposed to get from us to help them defend themselves against Russia, and saying, you're only going to get that aid if you manufacture dirt on Joe Biden, the essential do us a favor, though. And Bolton, we believed, knew exactly what the scheme was, but Bolton refused to come forward, and he essentially said, see you in court. So he writes a book instead of coming forward to tell us what he knew, called The Room Where It Happened, obviously a play on the Hamilton song. But the room where it happened was not any place that John Bolton came near. The room where it happened was where those witnesses like Fiona Hill and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Masha Yovanovitch, the ambassador to Ukraine, came forward and testified. And so while John Bolton may have provided in his book information that we'll continue to investigate, I don't think he'll ever deserve to be in the same category as those three individuals, some of whom which worked for John Bolton.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about bipartisanship. So one of the things that you said at the beginning of the book, and in quotes here, is so much of being in Congress has to do with trust and relationships. And those are built during those little unplanned conversations you have when you meet in a Capitol hallway. Obviously, you're not meeting in a Capitol hallway as much anymore right now, but even before the pandemic, how often were those unplanned conversations where trust and relationships get built happening between Republicans and Democrats? And maybe use yourself as an example.
There's always been tension, and our founders created a system of checks and balances in a multi-party system where that would be the case. However, never since Donald Trump do I believe people were so willing to abandon their principles of what their philosophy of governing is, just to line up behind one individual. And so my first 4 years were defined by 2/3 of the legislation I supported was bipartisan. As a freshman member, when the Democrats were in the minority, I had more pieces of legislation signed into law than any other Democrat that was a freshman. And that was because of friendships that I built. I described in the book that one Republican and I had gone to a trip to Antarctica around climate change, and we got stuck in New Zealand and spent a day together waiting for the flight to take off to Antarctica, just hanging out and getting to know each other, and literally, having a beer in New Zealand. We went out and rented a boat and we're swimming in the ocean. And it's just that's the kind of, you have to go to the bottom of the world, I guess, to find a friendship like that. But I had a lot of friendships like that, and passed a lot of bills from people I had worked with. And what was so frustrating to me was perhaps how naive I was. And so I guess I blame myself a little bit to believe that after the 2016 campaign, when we learned on the Intelligence Committee what the Russians had done, I thought, well, we're all going to agree, regardless of who's president, that we should at least never allow this to happen again. And the number of Republican colleagues who told me privately, I don't like what Russia did, I don't like how the president embraces them, but when he tweets, the president, he wins. They were telling me that they were afraid of losing their job because the president would tweet at them, and then someone more conservative or more Trump-like would come along. And frankly, that is, I think, worse than actually believing in what Donald Trump is doing. If you believe that the way he governs so corruptly is okay, I can accept that. What I don't agree with you, I think it's wrong, but I don't accept those who know it's wrong, but so narrow-mindedly think, well, I will lose my job if I speak up, so I'm just going to enable it. I think that's worse, and that's what I witnessed.
So at the end of the day, did this trust in relationships really matter if people don't have the courage to stand up to leadership?
That's right, and I hope it comes back, Colleen. I really do. To give you another example, it may seem so trivial, but again, just going back to, it's the little things. Chairman Nunes is a big Oakland Raiders fan. Adam Schiff grew up in the East Bay, went to Monte Vista High School, big Oakland Raiders fan. We had worked so well together as a committee before Donald Trump was elected. Almost everything passed out of the Intelligence Committee in a bipartisan way. To celebrate, some recent work we had done in 2015, I had the president of the Raiders make a jersey for Nunes and Schiff with their names on it. And I remember, again, they didn't see eye to eye on policies, but they did share a love for the Raiders and a belief that on intelligence issues, we have to work together. But when Donald Trump was elected, I saw a complete abandonment of any, willingness to work with us on that investigation. And to Adam Schiff's credit, we did something that we would not normally do on the Intelligence Committee, which is to speak publicly, to give news interviews about what we were seeing. And that's because most of the work we do is classified. Right. But Schiff believed that unless the American people knew the evidence that was being buried, that it would truly be buried and we wouldn't be able to protect the country from further interference. And so that's why I went from probably appearing on, a national news interview fewer than 10 times to, daily with my Intelligence Committee colleagues talking about, what was going on.
Your schedule sounded when I was reading the book, it sounded very hectic. During this time, how did you actually have time to record what was happening in the level of detail that you did and then write a book? What was that? What was your writing process?
And we had 2 children in the first 2 years of the Trump administration. I told my wife, I don't even think it would be possible to have more, than we did in that first 2 years. Right. But it was really, as I said earlier, I really wanted to tell the stories of the people who courageously came forward. And so I had a custom every night when I was able to be home of putting my daughter to bed, and she is very high maintenance when it comes to going down. She has a rigid routine that must be followed, and it includes, a specific number of blankies and a certain book that has to be read and certain songs that have to be sung. And if you skip them, she would fuss. And this is as an 11-month-old at the time. And so what I did when I would put her down, I downloaded a dictation app. And so I put the phone, right next to where I would put my daughter down, and I would work in stories as I told her bedtime stories. I would work in what we were doing in the investigation, so that I could at least get it on my phone, transcribed, and pushed over into a Word document. But I had to do it in a sing-song voice, otherwise she wouldn't go along with it. And so if you listen to the audio version, it's a very dark children's story. But it was only with her cooperation that I was able to find the time to get all of this chronicled.
Would you care to sing for us some of those lullabies?
I remember going back and listening to one of them, and it was like, and Mr. Schiff told Mr. Meadows, please sit down. You are not recognized. It was like a Dr. Seuss cadence that I guess I was projecting.
That's awesome. So toward the end of the book, you hang your hopes on, and you've mentioned it here already, on voting Trump out of office this November. Now, we know that the pandemic is placing an enormous strain on the election system. And there's been some, people are potentially going to be using this to try to advance their agenda around suppressing the vote. We've seen some encouraging signs and some very discouraging signs. So on the discouraging side, we had the primaries in Georgia and Wisconsin, which, were very, poorly managed and not very safe for folks to get out and cast their ballot. But on the positive side, I just read this week that it looks like there's now about 3/4 of Americans will have access to vote by mail, which is extraordinary. From your position in the House, how confident are you that we are going to be able to run an accessible and safe election this November? And what is Congress doing to make sure that we fund that?
Yeah, we've been voting by mail literally since the Civil War. It has been a trusted way to vote. And, up until this election, 2/3 of Americans have been able to vote by mail. And I believe that the president seeks to, hang doubt around the outcome by creating this false narrative that, mail-in balloting is fraudulent when there's no evidence of any widespread fraud around mail-in balloting. And so what we have sought to do in the different relief packages that we've passed in Congress is to fund the state's ability to expand mail-in balloting so people don't have to make the choice between my vote and my health, as you mentioned in Wisconsin. That's been a red line for Republicans, largely because the president has indicated he won't go with that. So we've not been able to pass that. And for us, maybe we should play hardball more, but playing hardball means that we wouldn't pass any economic relief. And as important as that is, still getting unemployment insurance benefits out there and getting the direct payments to families who needed it, the Paycheck Protection Plan. We wanted to get that relief out there and continue to fight, to fund vote by mail. I believe what we should be more public about is that if we ultimately are not able to fund it federally, that if Joe Biden is elected president, that the Democrats pledge to reimburse any state that takes on an additional cost because of expanding access by mail. But, Colleen, what worries me is that most presidents are reelected. That's the nature of just the incumbency. In our lifetime, only two have not been, Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush. And at this point, during those races, both Carter and Bush were behind, but they still ran hard, but they ran honorable races. The difference between those individuals and this president is one, as I said, he has governed corruptly the entire term, but Donald Trump is the only president who will likely face criminal charges if he leaves office. And so the power or the incentive to sabotage, the mail, to stay in office, to welcome foreign interference, to, help deliver misinformation, the incentive is so great. And that's what I think we're up against. Because traditionally, with this kind of economy and the failures of leadership in a pandemic and on racial justice issues, he would be well on his way out of office. But there's this gauntlet that the Biden campaign has to go through of being up against, those factors. And that makes it much more difficult.
I want to go to an audience question that came in because it's related to this question, but they're more specific about what can Congress do to ensure that the United States Postal Service has appropriate bandwidth to enable mail-in voting. Of course, this would be just from those state. If you've talked to some of the secretaries of state in the places where they have all mail-in voting, it's a real undertaking. And then making sure that the postal workers can be socially distanced as they're counting ballots, et cetera. What kind of power does Congress have to leverage their power to bolster the resources of USPS?
Thanks for the question, Pascal. We are seeking to provide the Postal Service with an additional $25 billion. That's what they believe and we assess they need to fulfill that obligation of not just mail-in ballots, but also the increased traffic during COVID as people try and stay home and rely on the mail for medication and other essential items. But the president has said that he is seeking to prevent the Postal Service from delivering mail-in ballots. And so whether he succeeds or not, just creating the confusion is a win for him, because if people have doubt about whether the ballot will even be counted, they may just not fill it out and they may not participate. And that's where Donald Trump is so masterful. He, I think, understands that he may not always win on every claim that he makes, but if he can make you question, whether you should even vote, then he wins anyway. So, Speaker Pelosi has resisted the Republican offer to extend unemployment benefits just by a week. That was their counter offer, because she doesn't only want to extend it to the end of the year, which I agree with. We should give that certainty to people. But we believe that funding the Postal Service is connected to COVID. Because of COVID, people should not be having to make that decision between health and vote. But I really do worry about that. And just as an anecdote, 2 nights ago, my wife and I were awakened just before midnight. Some of your viewers probably have a ring alert on your phone. It's a distinctive sound, and I jumped up, saw on the ring, like, goes 10 seconds back, that someone was at the door just before midnight. So I ran downstairs with the dog, and it was a letter carrier dropping off a package. And I've never seen that before. And this poor letter carrier, I don't know why they're working so late. It's not safe for them to be alerting people that late at night. So something clearly is going on with the Postal Service in the way that it is being dismantled. And I do fear this is a way Donald Trump will try and stay in power.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I've been seeing our post person coming by around 9 o'clock at night recently. So yeah, there are lots of heroes out there these days working on the front lines. We should really be sure that we're treating them like heroes and paying them like heroes and giving them health insurance like heroes and benefits like heroes. We can talk about all of that as well in a bit. I want to lay something, I want to put out something that you said in the book against the current landscape. So in the book, you said this: "It is so deeply ingrained in our national psyche to give people the benefit of the doubt, assume they are acting in good faith." Now, in that quote, you are referring to a couple of the president's treatment towards Putin. But this sentiment, that presumption of good intent, is part of our national psyche, and it really struck me in this moment in particular. Do you think that in our country that assumption of good intent extends to Black people?
Can you rephrase that?
How do you
rephrase? You say it again. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. So you mentioned that there's kind of a national psyche that we assume the best of people. We assume good intent, and that really struck me. I mean, I feel like I'm very much that way, to a fault sometimes, my husband says. But it struck me to hear that in this moment, because we're having this this reckoning around racial discrimination, around inequities that exist, and racial justice. And I was wondering, does this national psyche of assuming good intent, do we extend that towards Black people as a nation?
Yeah, I understand. That's a great question. I think Brian Stevenson said it best, who has written extensively on racial justice, that Black men in particular, but too often also Black women, are perceived by non-Black men and women as guilty and dangerous. That is a perception that is in the American psyche and has been reinforced over and over since our original sin of slavery. And that's why I think one of the things that we have to do to reverse that and scrub that out of our psyche is to pass police reform. We did that in the House with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. But if that's all we do, that will be really insufficient, because what I have come to learn, whether working in Oakland as a prosecutor or running for president and going to many of America's cities, that a failure to invest in Black communities has created a deficit of hope and has contributed to the dehumanization of Black Americans. And so investing in schools, investing in healthcare, investing in jobs is so desperately needed. And yes, of course, having criminal justice reform. And that point I was making in the book was about, how we've traditionally viewed Russia, as an adversary, that whether it was George W. Bush who said he looked at Putin and saw, into his soul, or just, trying to convince everyday Americans that Russia, even today is still an adversary, has proved to be a challenge. But I do believe that we have a systemic, racism issue in our country that institutionally and individually needs to be addressed.
What does Black Lives Matter mean to you?
That no life can matter until Black Lives Matter. And that while every person, I think when they say, well, all lives matter, don't they, needs to understand, any person that says all lives matter needs to understand that all lives cannot matter until a population in our country that has historically been discriminated against also equally matters. And that's what they are asking for. I spoke to a couple weeks ago, in my district, had convened leaders in the community at one of the largest Black churches in Hayward. And we had a conversation about civil rights and racial justice. And one person spoke up and said, look, as a Black man in this diverse area, I only feel safe twice a day. First, when I wake up in my own home, and second, when I walk through the door after work into my own home. He said, in between, when I drive my car, a nice car that I worked hard to, pay for, I see people who are my neighbors, people who live on my block, look at me as if I had to do a drug deal or something bad to get the car. He said, I see police officers drive behind me all the time and run my plates because they think I, as a Black man, might have a warrant out for my arrest. What was so striking about this person telling me this is that he is a captain for the largest police force in my congressional district. And so you can imagine, if a Black man in law enforcement doesn't feel safe outside of his home, how do people who have no connection to law enforcement feel? And that really struck me, and I, motivated to do all I can to change that.
Has this moment caused you to examine your own white privilege more closely, and how so, if you're willing to share?
Yeah, it has. And I think it's natural for, white men, when they hear white privilege, because, a couple of years ago when I first heard this, the first response was, well, I grew up in living in 11 different places that we rented and going to 9 different schools, and was the first in my family to go to college. Like, don't tell me, I have a privilege. And then I really, came to appreciate, talking to, Black friends, Black colleagues, people on my staff, that white privilege means that it's not just about money. It's about how you're perceived by others. That when I drove, as a teenager, I didn't have to worry about the same things that young Black men have to worry about. That when I walk down the street and, a white person walks in the opposite direction, that I'm not viewed as guilty and dangerous as a Black man would be viewed. And so, I think it's okay to, have that reaction if you're open-minded enough to evolve and understand that there is a privilege with the color of your skin. And the best thing that you can do is seek to make sure that we are all treated equally, and recognize that right now we're not.
Yeah. You mentioned the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and of course you all, I think you were an original co-sponsor of that, and then it was passed in the House. It's now unlikely to go anywhere at all in the Senate. So what are your hopes for? And as you mentioned, that is insufficient, but it is still it's important but insufficient. What are your hopes for actually getting any reform in that space at the federal level? I mean, we are seeing changes at the local level, but at the federal level, and also why did Congress wait so long to act on this? This has been a problem for a very, very long time. You've been in Congress for 8 years. Why did it take this long to get around to it?
It shouldn't. It took an individual tragedy of George Floyd to expose the, as I said, institutional racism and oppression that we have seen. And my personal experience professionally, when I was working in the Alameda County District Attorney's Office, I thought after Oscar Grant was murdered, I believe it was 2009 on New Year's Day, by a police officer, that would bring change locally and also nationally. And while our office prosecuted that officer when at a time when not enough officers who had unjustifiably killed Black Americans were not being prosecuted, you didn't see the change that should have come then. And so from 2009 all the way to when George Floyd was killed and beyond, the violence against Black men in America has continued. And the best thing we can do now is to see this passed in the Senate, see it signed into law, but as I said, address the other issues that affect the Black community. And there's no better time than the present. And also, I support a national commission on studying reparations that my colleague Sheila Jackson Lee has supported, and also a truth and healing and reconciliation commission that Barbara Lee has sponsored for us to, again, fully come to terms with what the original sin means in our country. I think until we fully come to terms with what slavery was, what it has done generationally, we're not going to ever get over this.
Yeah, agreed. Well, thank you for working on all those issues. I think they are incredibly important and can help to start going a better path forward. Of course, switching gears here a little bit, the big news this week, of course, is the selection of Kamala Harris for Biden's vice president. So some more California representation, excellent. But that does open up the seat on the Senate. So any interest in your part in that potentially open Senate seat next year?
So Colleen, you're telling me that seat would be open because Joe Biden is president, Kamala Harris is vice president, and Donald Trump is no longer in office? I say, give me that problem of sorting out what to do with the Senate seat. But right now, I'm going to do all I can to help them get elected. And my goal, and the reason I chose to run for re-election, is to continue to work on this issue of gun violence. While I've used my experience as a prosecutor, to hold the president accountable with others in Congress, my real passion is to see movement in Congress on the issue of gun violence. So I look forward to having that problem, come November 3rd. But right now, I want to see them elected.
Excellent. Tell me a little bit more about why you ran. Gun violence is a big issue for you. It's been one of your top priorities, and as one of your constituents, I've seen your emails and notes on this for a long time. But tell me why, what inspired you to make that really the top priority on your campaign, on your ticket, when you were campaigning for the Democratic presidential nomination?
One of the first homicide cases I prosecuted, a 16-year-old boy named Ronnie Greer was killed in Oakland. In that case, to see a child, 16, he's a child. And then the next couple cases were also a 17-year-old who was killed just a couple days before he was to graduate from Castlemont High School. And I'll never forget, I asked his mom for a photo to show the jury. And she gave me his prom picture. And I noticed in the prom picture that the purple Chucks that he was wearing in the prom picture were the same Chucks that he was wearing at the scene of his murder. And just seeing children killed by guns, it just makes you want to do something about it. And so that was in part why I ran for Congress. And then during congressional orientation, Sandy Hook happened, and one of my colleagues who had just been elected was to represent Newtown. And I believed, well, this is a moment. Like, we're going to be able to do something about gun violence. And how naive was I? I signed up to try and get colleagues to support the assault weapons ban, and I was surprised that even people in my own party at the time were not in favor of it. And then we just went on this carousel from Sandy Hook to Orlando to Las Vegas to Parkland, and it just felt like it would never end. But after Parkland, what inspired me was that the difference between Sandy Hook and Parkland was the age of the children. They were still children, but these students were able to articulate their loss, and were also able to articulate what they had to do next. And so out of unimaginable grief, they picked themselves up and they marched. And they did these 50-mile marches to different congressional offices. And they were a part of the effort that beat 19 NRA-endorsed members of Congress, helping to give us the majority. So I ran for president wanting to be a champion for that issue, and recognizing that young people had really made themselves vulnerable, participating in a way that they typically don't, and wanted to be, someone who would deliver on those issues. And so now I'm still in Congress, and I think that's the best place right now to serve that issue. And I don't want to let them down. And I know that they're not going to let us let them down, because they're going to keep marching, and they're going to make sure that we have a day where my 3-year-old, my hope, this is how I measure it, Colleen, is that my timeline on this is that when my son Nelson and daughter Cricket go to middle school, that they would ask me, Dad, did kids really duck under their desks to do shooter drills? That it would be such a foreign concept that they wouldn't believe that we actually did that because we did something about it, and they never had to live it.
Any hope with the news from just last week around the New York Attorney General's lawsuit to dissolve the NRA?
Yeah, and we shouldn't dissolve the NRA because they support the Second Amendment. That is in the Constitution, and the right to free speech is paramount. We should dissolve them because corruption is really what is happening over there, and that's what should offend all of us. Is that this is not about a belief in people being able to hunt with their families, shoot for sport, or protect themselves. That this is an organization that panders to grievances so that people contribute money to their organization, so that those at the very top can fly around on private jets, stay at 5-star hotels, spend over $100,000 on suits that none of their members would be able to afford. That's why they should be dissolved, is because they're profiting personally on the fear that they're peddling to their members, and it's making us less safe because politicians who take their money don't want to stand up against them. So I am encouraged that in 2018 more money was spent by gun safety organizations, small dollars like Moms Demand Action and others, than was spent by the NRA. And that's what gives me hope.
That's great. Last question before we turn over to some of our audience questions. So if you have a burning question that you would like the congressman to get to, please put it into the Q&A on Zoom. But last question for me before we go into those questions. Our philanthropic community, Battery Powered, we're now focused on how we can support an equitable recovery from the pandemic, where we really look at the inequities that have been exposed through this pandemic so brightly, and how we can support an inclusive and equitable recovery from it. So what is some of your advice for us, the average citizen, the average philanthropist, that we can best support this recovery and be a partnership with the government to do that in an effective way?
Well, thank you for asking. Thank you, Battery Powered, for all that you're doing. And to me, this pandemic has essentially, if you were on the edge of the cliff, you've gone over. And it's not just folks who lost their jobs, who were working wage jobs, in retail or the service industry. It's people who were already, poor, in poverty, unemployed, trying to find a job. They are the ones now who have been evicted, who are hungry, or who have just recently lost their job. And I worked at a food bank in Hayward a couple weeks ago, last week, where it was a 2-hour drive-through food bank line. And most of the people never would have imagined 6 months ago being in that line. And it was heartbreaking. One of the persons in the line, she asked me for a second loaf of bread. And I just thought, yeah, of course, like, we'll give you a second loaf of bread. And one of the volunteers looked at me and said, no. Like, we don't have enough. Like, if we give her a second loaf, we won't be able to give the last person in line a loaf of bread. And that is how dire things are right now. So as basic as it seems as a need, our food banks need so much help right now. And the volunteers there pleaded with me. They said, please continue to support the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, because we don't have enough food to give the people who are waiting for 2 hours in line the food they need.
Well, food security is one of the areas that we are focused on. And for those of you who are tuning in, and who are Battery members, we are going to be having a volunteer day with the food banks very soon. So keep your eyes peeled for that. They need lots of help. Like Congressman said, there's a huge increase in demand. So let's get to some of our audience Q&A. I'm going to start with one from Pascal. Thank you, Pascal. Do you believe that the impeachment process we just went through has permanently changed the checks and balances and weakened the role of Congress to hold the executive branch accountable?
No, I believe we reaffirmed checks and balances and the importance of it by impeaching the president. And one of the debates that we had early on was, well, if the outcome in the Senate is all but certain that they will not remove him, why even go through this exercise? And I very strongly believed and argued at the time that if we did not impeach the president, because the facts were not really in dispute. I mean, he essentially copped to the crime by releasing the transcript where he said, do us a favor though. So if we didn't impeach the president, we might as well take that remedy out of the Constitution. So that was my first fear, was that we had the evidence, we should do it. Second, we shouldn't assume that we knew what the Senate was going to do, that it's a chicken and the egg problem, that if we don't act because we think that they will acquit, we let them off the hook, and we don't develop the case that you have to develop anyway to send over to them. So it was very much like, if you build it, they will come, hopefully. Third, I really believe and feared that if we did not impeach the president, you could have a corrupt president 20, 30 years from now who would say, well, Donald Trump did this, this, and this, and you didn't impeach him for that. And so I didn't want to see the standard of conduct lowered. And finally, while he was not removed from office, if you think about why we impeached him, for holding up $400 million in aid to have a foreign government cheat an election for him, Ukraine got the aid. And they only got the aid after we started the investigation. And all of the bullshit reasons that Trump had given for why they were being withheld, having the aid withheld, nothing changed between when the investigation started and when they got the aid. None of the reasons that he listed, nothing changed. So it was only because the investigation started, which taught me, if you check this president, he ultimately will fold. So keep checking him all the way until January 20.
Another question from our audience. Does your intelligence committee possess new information beyond what the public knows? I sure hope you know more than we do, by the way, that further proves criminality, Trump or Barr, and would clearly disqualify them only if leaked to the public.
Well, I'll just say this, that my biggest concern of what I see every day on the intelligence committee is that the country that interfered in the 2016 election with a preferred candidate, and a candidate that welcomed their interference, that asked them to hack his opponent's emails, that planned for the interference, that country continues to do that. And that just in the last week, the director of national intelligence said that the Russians prefer, that not only do they prefer for Donald Trump to be elected again, that they are working to do so, and that they are seeking to denigrate Joe Biden. So this is exactly what they were doing in 2016. And Donald Trump is doing nothing and saying nothing about it. And that is what I think makes us most at risk of our elections not belonging to us. on the issue of, who will be prosecuted post Donald Trump, my hope is that it's completely void of politics, that we go back to an independent rule of law. And I propose that we have a presidential crimes commission, and that independent prosecutors not affiliated with Joe Biden or Donald Trump would look at any potential crimes out there and recommend a prosecution, so that the American people would believe that they are legitimate and it's not just retaliation to the other side. I think it's so important in what we do in the next coming years post Donald Trump to restore the faith that people have in the rule of law. And so, I don't think I, as a elected official, should be deciding, what crimes they're on the hook for. But I do think that we need independent prosecutors to look at them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Another question, and this is from the recent hearing with William Barr. Rebecca, thanks for your question. She mentioned that she listens to the Preet Bharara podcast, who I guess had lots of kudos from him about how you questioned him. I also watched that, and you were pretty tough on him. Tell us a little bit about how you prepared for that, and a little bit more about that hearing.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. And the best advice I received as a young prosecutor was practice and preparation. That if you watch a closing argument that is effective, or a cross-examination that's effective, it's not an accident. It's because the lawyer practiced and was prepared. And with Barr, I did watch a lot of his prior testimony to Congress to get a sense of how he would respond, to tough questions. I thought Kamala Harris had actually been the most effective person to question him before our hearing. And so, watched, because you get 5 minutes, 300 seconds, right? And there's so many topics to cover. And my goal is just for the American people to, get the truth. And I wanted to focus on, and I think it was fitting, on the Roger Stone commutation. I led the interview of Roger Stone for the Intelligence Committee. It was that interview that was 2 of the counts for which he was convicted of in front of a jury. And so I thought it was fitting and kind of full circle in a way that I could ask the Attorney General why Donald Trump was not being investigated for essentially pardoning Roger Stone, when Roger Stone had said that he had the goods on Trump and was staying quiet. Because at his confirmation hearing, Bill Barr said if a president traded a pardon for a witness's silence, that would be a crime. And I prepared in a lot of ways for that interview with Barr. What I did not prepare for was for him to ask me a question back. So I don't know if you recall, I asked him if he was investigating Donald Trump. He just said no. And I asked, it's a dangerous question for any lawyer to ask of a witness, an open-ended question, but I said, why not? And he said back to me just so smugly, he said, why would I? And so I think that's where, having kind of a grasp of the case helped me when he kind of put me back on my heels. I went through his prior statements and everything that Trump said about Stone and Stone said about Trump. I laid out in the book, Colleen, that before the Mueller hearing, I did not have the luxury of getting a little bit of sleep because my son woke up at 5 a.m. that morning and wanted pancakes. And so I was trying to make him pancakes, keep him happy, prepare for Mueller very soon after.
Just the typical morning in a busy household.
But because my wife read the book, when Barr testified, the night before Barr testified, she said to me, I'll get up with the kids this morning.
I'll do the pancakes.
I won't make you relive the Mueller horror of being up at 5 a.m. and then being tired at 10 a.m. when you have to question the special counsel. So
you answered my most pressing question. Did your wife read your own book?
She did the Audible version, which I thought.
Do you narrate it?
Why? I read it.
You read it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know why she wanted to torture herself in that way, but. Yeah, she did the Audible version. It is available in an Audible version, which is the hardest thing to do because when you do an Audible or when you do a book on tape, essentially, there's no multitasking. So we're all used to, even on Zoom, you're on your phone, you're multitasking. You have to read every single word perfectly, and you can't be looking at anything else. So that took a lot of time.
Did you do a lot of retakes?
Yes.
Oh, good. Well, I read it, but I do love listening to a book when it's narrated by the author. So I might have to.
Or a British voice. That's my favorite.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one. I listen to the sleep stories on Calm in a British voice.
Right.
We have time for just one or two, maybe more questions from the audience. There's a couple questions related to Citizens United and dark money in politics and their impact on partisanship. So one question is around, how might we overturn that? How might we overcome what's happened as a result of Citizens United? Another question is about hearing from David Brooks in an editorial in the New York Times that there might be a small contingency of members emerging in the Republican Party that are pivoting away from, their words, pandering to these wealthy interest groups that fund their campaigns and instead finding ways to address their constituents. Is that a real thing? Do you see that starting to happen more? No.
No, it's not. And that's what's been so frustrating for me is, as I said, they stick their necks out just a millimeter. Donald Trump tweets at them, and then like turtles, they put their head back in the shell, and you never hear from them again. Ben Sass, great example. And I like Ben Sass, and he's a smart, principled senator, but never spoke up once in this administration, except when the president issues an executive order last week. All of a sudden, his constitutional values are violated, and he tweets out that the president can't do that to issue an executive order on COVID. And then the president immediately went right back at him. And my spoiler alert is that Ben Sass is going to continue to confirm all of the president's judges. And if he could vote again on removing the president, he would vote the same way. And so in the book, I thought, the full measure of, political courage was really Mitt Romney, because he risked his political career to vote guilty. And pays the price every day, I'm sure, from the president. But I think he'll be able to walk away holding his head up high. On the question of outside money in politics, I hope in our lifetime we have publicly financed campaigns. We passed the very first piece of legislation that was filed in this new Congress was called the For the People Act, which we just named the John Lewis Act, renamed it. It strips down to the studs the Citizens United ruling, which says that money is speech. Absent a constitutional amendment, this would go the farthest to bring transparency, but also gets rid of partisan gerrymandering, where politicians can draw the lines, whether it's Democratic or Republican, for the party in power and for their friends. And it would make it like California, where federally we would have an independent commission that, God forbid, relies on math and geography.
Yeah, and that commission was just filled, I think, yesterday or the day before in California. It's a fascinating process, and there's a great podcast about it on the 538 show if anybody's interested in learning more. Okay, I think you're gonna love this last question from our audience. I love this one. It's from Erica Martinez, and she asks.
I was hoping you'd ask this one.
Yes, saved it for last, right? She mentioned that she's been inspired to run for Congress in her home state of Texas, but she doesn't have any political background. What advice do you give to people like her when they want to get in a race to be the voice of the American people in their own districts?
We need her.
Erica for Congress.
Yes, it's people like Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, and Alyssa Slotkin of Michigan, and Elaine Luria of Virginia, women who had worked in national security but not political positions, served in the military or in the intelligence community, who stepped up with no political offices that they had held prior and helped us win the House in 2018. And it was women like those three and many others with no political experience, just a set of values and life experience that came forward for impeachment when it was not necessarily politically popular. And they wrote an op-ed to the Washington Post about why they were supporting impeachment. And so while political office, can be helpful, I actually think sometimes it can make you too calculating, so to speak, or it can make you overthink, what really matters. And so I think we are well served by those who ran. And I'll just say this, my interns often ask when we have a departing lunch, what does it take, to run for office or to get to Congress? And I think the best advice I can give, and this is the advice I give myself, is to not run for an office, but run on issues, and you'll find the office. And too many people I've seen, myself included, when I first moved home after law school, I wanted to run for the Dublin City Council where I grew up. And a mentor who was the mayor said, no, you're coming in too hot. Why don't you get on the Planning Commission and the Arts Commission and learn some of the commissions? So I did 4 years of the Arts Commission and the Planning Commission. And finally, he said, I think you know the city well enough and you've learned the issues to run for office. And so I did. And I'm glad he gave me that advice, because if I had just come in hot and run for office, two things would have happened. I would have lost. And I think I would have been so demoralized that I would never have gone into public service again. And so I've always tried to tell our interns or anyone that asks, find the issues you care about, and you will find the offices to serve those issues. And Erica, I'm looking forward to seeing what you do next.
Well, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you with us tonight. It was well worth the wait to get you with us. And thank you so much for your service, for everything you're doing for our country, and for being with us tonight and sharing your words of wisdom.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you to Battery Powered.
Great. Well, thank you to everybody who's joined us tonight. It was our pleasure to have you here. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night.
Good night.